The storm had been walking toward him all day. Out on the high Wyoming plain, you could see such things coming from a long way off if you knew how to look. The slow thickening of the sky along the western rim, the way the light lost its color by degrees until even the yellowed grass seemed ash gray, the restless shiver of the cottonwoods along the creek bed. By mid-afternoon, the horizon had hardened into a dark, uneven line that was not mountain, not cloud, something between, heavy with snow and old grudges. Daniel Price rode straight into it, because there wasn't anywhere else left to go. His horse was a dun mare with a stubborn heart and a hollow barrel, every rib drawn in sharp relief beneath winter's leanness. She picked her way along the faint suggestion of a trail, hooves crunching through old crusted drifts and new powder alike. Daniel's gloved hand lay loose on the reins, not so much guiding her as sharing the road. The saddle creaked in quiet, weary rhythm beneath him. His left shoulder burned with every step. The bullet was high and clean, in the sense that men who carried guns used the word. It had gone through the meat below his collarbone the day before out near Red Willow Pass, where the canyon walls squeezed in close enough that even the boldest rider started to feel the weight of all that rock overhead. It wasn't the wound itself that worried him. It was the cold. Cold had a way of getting into blood and bone and making friend with things that should have been pushed out. He could feel fever already tapping along the edges of his thoughts, polite for now. It would get less polite as the dark came down. The land around him rolled away in broken distances, a long wash of sage and snow and scrub. In summer it would be hard and golden, waves of grass moving to some invisible wind song. Now it was a quilt of white and brown, stitched with the dark threads of leafless willows and wind-scoured rock. Somewhere far off a creek talked to itself under a crust of ice, the sound thin but stubborn. There was no other soul in sight. There hadn't been since noon, when he'd watched the last thin line of chimney smoke disappear behind him like a promise he wasn't entitled to keep. Daniel rode with his coat collar turned up against the wind, and his hat brim, pulled low, head bent just enough to suggest a man who had been walking into one kind of weather or another for an awfully long time. The scar along his jaw, white and thin, earned in another winter that had nothing to do with snow, pulled tight when the wind hit his face. He ignored it. He ignored most things these days. It was easier that way. He'd left his name behind in more than one town over the years. Left other things, too. Some he missed more than others. Tonight he carried only what he couldn't talk himself out of. A six-shooter with an honest amount of lead, an old bedroll, a shirt stuck to his skin where blood had dried stiff along the seam, and a weight in his chest that no one but him could see. The sky above him dropped another shade closer tonight. The front edge of the storm was almost upon him now. He could feel it in the way the air thickened, in the sudden, uneasy toss of the mare's head, in the strange, hollow hush that fell over the land when even the wind stopped to draw breath. He knew better than to be out in this. Any man who'd been through one of these plains blizzards and lived could tell you the same. But the men behind him had been close when he left the pass, and 3 days' head start felt thin with a price on his head, and a marshal who took things personal. Somewhere back there in the narrowing stone, someone had shouted his name. Not the one on the posters. The other one. The one only men who'd ridden beside him once upon a time knew. That had done more damage than the bullet. He didn't plan on giving them a second chance to say it. The first flakes started to fall as the world slid from gray into something darker. They came down big and slow at first, soft as feathers, each one catching briefly on his coat before joining its fellows on the ground. Soon there were more, and more, until the air between him and his horse's ears was full of them. The wind found its voice again, rising in a low, building moan that snagged in the bare branches and tugged at his sleeves. Daniel narrowed his eyes, peering through the white. There, far ahead and slightly downslope, a flicker of amber against the gathering dark. He reined the mare toward it without thinking. Light meant fire. Fire meant walls. Walls meant a place where he could sit with his back to something solid while the sky tried to tear itself apart. The storm might still get him. Fever might. But he'd be damned if he let himself turn to ice in the open like some forgotten fence post. The land dipped into a shallow hollow there, a bowl scooped out of the long slope by time and old water. In the crook of it, stubborn against the elements, a homestead clung on. A cabin squatted with its back to a stand of stunted pines, logs gone silver with age. A small barn leaned into the same wind, boards patchworked with newer planks. A fence traced a jagged line around a yard where a single clothesline hung slack and empty. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin blue ribbon quickly lost to the low, scudding clouds. The light he'd seen came from one window at the front of the cabin, a soft, steady glow that looked impossibly warm from where he rode. He pulled the mare to a stop at the edge of the yard and sat there a moment, listening. Wind, the soft chink of tack, the faint complaining creak of the barn door shifting on its hinges. From inside the cabin, nothing he could hear over the storm's growing voice. No laughter, no voices at all. He swung down from the saddle. The ground came up too fast, and the shaft of pain that cut through his shoulder drove the breath from him for a heartbeat. He caught himself on the saddle horn, jaw clenched, vision narrowing to a hot white tunnel before spreading back out again. Snow whirled around him, thickening by the moment. Daniel looped the reins over the fence post nearest the cabin steps. His fingers were clumsy in his gloves. Blood had seeped through the bandage under his shirt again, warm for a moment and then leaching away into the cold. He took 3 steps toward the porch. "Don't come any closer." The voice cut through the snow and wind as cleanly as if someone had swung a blade. It came from just inside the flickering rectangle of door and lamplight. A woman's voice, tight with something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite anger, sat brittle on the wire between them. Daniel stopped. The door was cracked open just a sliver. The lamplight behind it shifted the way it does when someone moves in front of it. He could feel eyes on him, measuring, deciding. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raw from cold and disuse. "I'm not looking for anything but shelter. Storm's coming in hard. I'll sleep in your barn if you'd rather." "You'll sleep out there in the dirt," she answered. "Or right on. Either way, you won't be crossing this threshold. I've had enough trouble come through that door to last 3 lifetimes." Her words were flat as old boards, but something in them trembled. Daniel shifted his weight, careful, feeling the strength run thin in his legs. "You got a doctor near?" he asked. "Or anyone knows one and a needle from the other?" "I don't have anyone near," she said, "and I aim to keep it that way." The wind gusted, driving a curtain of snow between them. The mare stamped behind him, snorting, sensing his wavering. Daniel stood in that white noise, a dark shape growing dim, and weighed his options. There weren't many. Stay here and die on her porch. Try to turn the mare back into the teeth of the storm and die somewhere nameless. Or be honest. "Don't mean to argue," he called, fighting to keep his voice steady. "But I don't think I'm riding anywhere tonight. I've been bleeding since yesterday. My choices are your dirt, your barn, or—" The ground tilted. His tongue felt too big in his mouth. The snow was suddenly very close, very bright. He didn't feel himself fall. He only registered the cold against his cheek, the sharp tang of trampled sage and old smoke, and the sound of the mare's reins slapping uselessly against the post. The storm closed over him like water. He woke to heat, not the confused, flickering kind that fever brought, all sharp edges and bad dreams, but the deep, steady warmth of a well-banked fire in a room built to hold on to it. For walls gathered close around him, keeping the wind somewhere else. The smell of wet wool and wood smoke and something herbal threaded through the air. He lay on a narrow bed, the sort of thing a man built with his own hands from whatever strait boards the land would surrender. The wool blanket scratching his chin smelled faintly of cedar. When he tried to lift his arm, his shoulder answered with a hot, bright lance of pain that stopped him cold. "Easy." The single word floated to him from somewhere near the foot of the bed. A woman's voice, the same one from the doorway, worn at the edges now with fatigue. His eyes blinked open. The cabin was small and square, built for use, not admiration. A rough table sat near the hearth, its scarred surface cluttered with a lamp, a chipped mug, a basin of water gone pink at the edges, a folded length of blood-stained cloth. Shelves along one wall held jars stuffed with dried plants, their shapes indistinct in the low light. Bundles of herbs hung upside down from the rafters, whispering against each other when the wind nudged the walls. She stood near his feet, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands stained brown-green from whatever tinctures she'd been handling. Her hair, dark and thick, was pulled back in a loose knot at the nape of her neck, stray strands curling around a face that might once have been called pretty before time, and grief chiseled it into something harder. A faint spray of freckles dusted the bridge of her nose. Her eyes, when they met his, were gray with a wash of blue, the color of a sky that couldn't make up its mind. There was a thin scar along her jaw, just in front of her left ear, that ran down toward her throat. It pulled tight when she frowned, as she did now. "You bled on my floor," she said. "Twice. Once outside. Once when I dragged you in." Daniel found his voice somewhere under the cotton in his mouth. "Could have left me out there," he said. "I know," she answered. She went back to the table, wrung out a cloth in the basin, and came to lay it gently against his forehead. The cool seeped into his skin, chased back some of the hammering in his skull. "How bad?" he asked. "Bullet went through clean." She moved the cloth to his neck, his cheek. "You're not dying from that unless you insist on being stubborn about it." Fever was trying to have its say. I told it no. He had the sense she'd told a lot of things no in her time. "Name's Daniel," he said, because it felt like he ought to put something honest into the room if she'd put this much work into keeping him in it. She hesitated just for a breath. "Mara," she said at last. The fire popped softly in the hearth, sending a little flare of light across her face. In that brief, bright moment, he saw the lines at the corners of her eyes, the tired set of her mouth, the way her shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with his. "Storm?" he asked. "Still out there," she said. "Too loud to hear yourself think if you stand on the porch. Wind's hitting the ridge sideways. Barn's holding." "The mare?" he managed. "Alive," Mara said. "Mean as a wet cat when I want to check her feet. I put down hay. You can thank me for that when you can stand up." He almost smiled. "What made you bring me in?" he asked after a moment. "From where I was laying? Seemed like you meant to leave me where I fell." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the fight in her eyes between what she'd learned and what she refused to unlearn. "The storm was coming," she said simply. "I know what it leaves behind when it's done. I've buried enough out here. Didn't feel like adding your bones to the fence line." He let the silence settle. It felt like a thing with weight, but not the crushing kind. The familiar ache of his shoulder, the heavy warmth of the fire, the quiet presence of someone else moving in the same room. After so many nights with only the sound of his own breath for company, it all felt strange and dangerous and almost like relief. "Thank you," he said. She shrugged, as if the words slid off her. "Don't make more of it than it is," she said. "You fell into my yard. I stitched you up. That makes you my problem until you can walk clean off my land. After that, we're even." He nodded, then regretted it when his vision swam. "Fair enough," he murmured. The storm's voice clawed at the edges of the cabin through the night, a low, ceaseless roar like an ocean he'd never seen. Sometimes it rose, sharp with gusts that pushed at the walls and made the window panes rattle. Sometimes it dropped to a long, drawn-out moan that seemed to come from somewhere older than the wind itself. Daniel drifted in and out of sleep, caught between the warmth of the bed and the memories that came whenever his guard slipped. A bank burning on a hot autumn night. Men on horses, faces lit orange from below. A man shouting his name through smoke. Another face, softer, smaller, turning away from him on a station platform years before that. Too many wrong ways to leave people behind. Each time he jerked awake, heart pounding, he caught some new slice of the present. Mara dropping the bar across the door with a solid, practiced thunk. Mara standing at the one small window that faced the track, one hand braced on the frame, shoulders rigid as she watched the white darkness beyond. Mara sitting at the table, head bowed over something small she held in both hands. A strip of cloth, a folded paper, he couldn't tell. Her lips moving soundlessly, as if arguing, "Whoever you're waiting on," he mumbled once, voice thick with sleep. "They'd be a fool to ride in this." She startled slightly, then shook her head. "Go back to sleep." she replied without turning. Storm's nothing. It's when it passes you have to worry. He didn't ask what she meant. The way her fingers tightened on the window frame told him enough. By morning, the worst of it had blown itself out. The world outside the cabin window had been scrubbed raw, every line sharpened by the clean, cold light that comes after a hard storm. The drifts in the yard were piled high, sculpted by the wind into strange frozen waves pinned at the moment of breaking. The sky overhead was a pale, untrusting blue. Daniel woke to the smell of coffee and something turning slow in a pan over the fire. His shoulder hurt less. No longer a jagged roar, just a steady dull ache that reminded him to move carefully. He pushed himself up onto his good elbow. The boards beneath his bare feet were cool, not cruelly cold. His boots sat near the bed, dried and cleaned of most of the mud and blood. Mara glanced over from where she stood by the stove. She didn't rush to help. Her gaze measured how far he got on his own, what he could manage, where he faltered. Something in her eased a fraction when he made it upright, without collapsing. You move like someone's taken a piece out of you, she observed. They did, he said. Bullet-sized piece. Left the rest. Her mouth twitched. Something not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. I figured as much from the hole in your shirt, she said. He reached up, fingers grazing the clean bandage. She'd wrapped it tight and neat, no wasted cloth, no wasted time. You went through my things, he said, voice mild. I needed something to bind you with, she replied. And I wasn't about to let you ruin my only decent quilt. His gaze flicked to the table by the door. His gun belt lay there, coiled like a sleeping snake. The revolver sat beside it, chambers empty, someone having taken the time to clean the dry blood from its grip. Mara followed his eyes. You won't be needing that until you can stand without the world tilting, she said. Maybe not even then. You reach for it in my house. I'll make sure you lie back down longer. He lifted a hand, palm out in something like surrender. Noted, he said. She brought him a chip plate with a biscuit and a fried egg, edges crisp gold in the pan. The smell hit him hard enough to make him lightheaded. He realized, suddenly, that he couldn't clearly remember the last hot meal that hadn't been eaten with his back to a tree and one eye always on the trail. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, Mara answered. You brought trouble with you. I can feel it, just haven't seen its face. He chewed slowly, food and coffee warming him from the inside out. You always talk like that? He asked after a bit. Like the world's waiting to fall on you? Only since it did, she said. They ate in a stillness that was quieter than the storm, but no less full. Outside, the snow ticked as it settled. Somewhere water dripped from the eaves in slow, patient drops. Far off, the creek sang louder now, swollen with melt. When he'd finished, Daniel set the empty plate aside, careful not to knock the mug. You're alone out here, he said. No other boots by the door. One plate, one cup. There used to be more, she said. It didn't feel like an invitation, but it didn't feel like a closed door, either. He waited. A man named Ellison came out with the first rush, she said after a while, voice flat in the way of someone telling a story they'd forced themselves to say enough times that the worst edges had worn off. Silver in the hills, they said. He brought me with him, then, 2 years later, a girl. Thought this would be a place where a man could build something with his hands and a woman could sleep without listening for the sounds of town drunks. She wiped her fingers on a cloth, eyes somewhere further than the cabin wall. Vein played out or shifted. Men got meaner when money got thinner. Then a man named Briggs decided there was more coin in protection than digging rock. Called his men the Ridge Company like it made them respectable. Took what they wanted. Called the rest dues. A name rippled through Daniel's memory like a stone dropped in a shallow pool. Harlan Briggs. He'd never ridden with him. He'd heard of him. Men who liked fire tended to learn each other's names, even if only to avoid sharing a job. Your husband? Daniel asked quietly. Stood up on this porch one evening with his hands empty, she said. Told Briggs he'd pay what he could, when he could, but he wouldn't let anyone lay hands on his family. They laughed. Then they hit him hard enough he didn't get up again. Sheriff in town said he was sorry, but the Ridge boys were too much for one man to stand against. Her thumb traced the old scar along her jaw, as if remembering where a fist had once glanced. When it was done, Some of the neighbors sold up and moved on. Some drifted further along the ridge, hoping trouble wouldn't follow. I stayed. Someone had to. She looked at him then, eyes steady. You said you weren't bringing trouble, she said. But trouble rides the same roads as men with bullet holes. You want to tell me who's looking for you, Daniel Price? He swallowed the last of the coffee, the bitter taste suddenly sharp on his tongue. Marshal out of Red Cliff, he said. Name of Keating. Good at his job. Too good. Last year, some men I used to know thought it was funny to put my name to something I didn't touch. Bank fire in San Angelo. People died. Keating doesn't much care that I walked away from that life before it started to burn. He only cares there's a poster with my face and print on it. How much? She asked. 1,000, he said. Alive. Dead's worth half. Mara nodded slowly. Her gaze flicked to the gun on the table, then back to his shoulder, as if measuring numbers against the sweat on his neck. You ride with them once, she said. People don't much care when you left. I know, he said. He didn't tell her about the time he hadn't left fast enough. The night he'd watched fire crawl across the rafters of a dance hall and realized some of those the job would be clean. There were things a man could say. There were things he could never quite form his mouth around. Outside, far down the track and faint beneath the hush of new snow, a sound threaded the air. Hoofbeats. Slow. Measured. More than one horse. Coming up the trail with the steady confidence of men who believed they had time on their side. Mara went still. The change in her was small, just a tightening around the mouth, a squaring of the shoulders, but the air in the cabin shifted with it. She set the mug down, moved to the window, and eased the curtain back with 2 fingers just enough to see. Daniel's hand went to his shoulder on instinct, fingers pressing against the bandage to brace against what he knew was coming. Ridge Company? He asked. She let the curtain fall. When she turned back, the scar on her jaw stood out, white against skin gone suddenly pale. Briggs doesn't ride himself much these days, she said. Sends men. But that's their look. 4, maybe 5 behind. Hard to count through the trees. She crossed to the wall where a rifle hung on 2 pegs, unhooked it, and checked the chamber with a quick, practiced movement. It struck Daniel, then what she'd meant the night before when she'd told him not to come closer. It hadn't been fear of him. It had been fear of what shadow chased him and how it would mix with the one already standing at her door. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. The room tilted, then steadied. The pain in his shoulder surged, then settled into a furious throbbing. You're not standing, Mara snapped. You're lying down and letting them pass. They won't, he said. Men like that don't ride out in a storm just to wave hello. Briggs sees a stranger's horse at your rail. He'll come in to see if it's worth selling. If he sees me, he'll think the law is sniffing at his boots and burn this place down just to prove he still can. Her jaw tightened. I've been alone a long time, she said. I know how to do it. I don't need you getting killed in my doorway to prove something to men who already know where I stand. He took a step toward her. It cost him more than it should have. The world narrowed to the space between them, and beyond that to the sound of the horses coming up the track, each soft thud a marker on a line he'd walked before. Mara, he said quietly, you dragged a half-dead stranger into your house instead of letting the snow bury him. That tells me more about you than you think. I've spent a long time running from the man I was when I rode with the wrong people. Maybe it's time I stood where he should have. Don't come closer, she whispered. But he did. He stopped just short of her, close enough to see the fear behind the anger in her eyes, close enough to feel the tremor in the air between them. Not fear of the men outside. She'd lived with that too long. Fear of watching one more body fall on the same patch of ground. You warned me once, he said. I heard you. Came anyway. I'm not leaving you alone with this. The hoofbeats slowed, stopped somewhere out of sight. Men's voices floated on the cold air. A low murmur, a short laugh that had no warmth in it, the soft jangle of tack and metal. Mara's breath caught. For a heartbeat, the cabin felt suspended, everything waiting to fall. Then she thrust the rifle into his hands. You're a fool, Daniel Price, she muttered. But I've only ever seen fools stand up to men like Briggs and make it mean anything. She crossed to a small cupboard, pulled out a shorter scattergun, and checked the shells with the same ruthless efficiency. You'll need these more than me, she added, tossing Daniel a cloth pouch that jingled softly with cartridges. If they get close enough for this, she lifted the shotgun. Things have already gone badly wrong. He slid the rifle's action, thumbed cartridges into the chamber. His hands remembered the motions too well. This was the trouble with leaving a life behind. Some parts of it came along whether you invited them or not. Outside, snow crunched under boots. Briggs' men didn't bother with knocking. "Stay back," Mara said. "I'll talk first." She moved to the door, shoulders squared, mouth set. Daniel took up position in the narrow shadow between the hearth and the window, where he could see the yard through a thin space between curtain and frame. For riders set their horses in the churned snow of the yard. No Briggs, as she'd said. Men in long coats, hats pulled low, scarves up over their mouths. The way they carried themselves said enough. Rifles lay across their saddles, not quite pointed at the cabin, not quite not. One of them nudged his horse forward and leaned to rap his gloved knuckles against the post. "Morning, Miss Ellison," he called. "We saw smoke. Figured we'd stop in, make sure everything's all right." Everything in his tone said he expected it wasn't, and that this pleased him. Mara opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch. She did not shiver, though the cold bit at her bare forearms where she'd pushed her sleeves up. "Storm came through," she said. "Lost a section of fence. Roof held. I don't recall asking for a welfare visit." The man on the horse laughed, a short, mean sound. "Briggs likes to keep his people accounted for," he said. "Makes him nervous when folks start thinking they can live up here and forget who keeps them safe." "Safe from who?" she asked. "From you." He shifted in the saddle, some of the smirk sliding off. "From men like the one with a price on his head riding this ridge," he said. "Marshal Keating came through town. Said a shot man headed this way yesterday. Said he's dangerous. Said there's money in pointing the right direction." Daniel felt Mara's breath catch even from where he stood. "That's so," she said. One of the other riders leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the porch, at the cleared stretches of snow, at the single set of new hoof prints in the yard that weren't theirs. "Looks like you had company," he remarked. "Storm didn't churn up that much ground by itself." Mara's fingers flexed on a shotgun. "Man came through," she said. "Fell in the yard. I brought him in, patched him up. He left at dawn. Didn't give a name." The first rider clicked his tongue. "Storm like that. He's dead already if he did," he said. "Seems wasteful, not to see if there's any profit in it. Mind if we take a look around? Couple of us look in your barn, couple of us take a peek indoors. Purely for your safety, Miss Ellison." "You stepped through my doorway with a gun in your hand," she said, "and the only thing you'll find is how fast you can bleed." The man's face hardened. He started to swing out of the saddle. "Or," Daniel said, stepping into the doorway beside her, "you could ride back to Briggs and tell him this ridge isn't taking his terms anymore." For heads snapped toward him. The rider saw the rifle in his hands, the bandage at his shoulder, the scar at his jaw. He saw, in turn, the flicker of recognition in the eyes of the nearest man as he matched those features to a crumpled piece of paper in his memory. "Price," the man breathed. "Sometimes," Daniel said. "Depends who's asking." "You're worth good money," another rider said, greed shoving aside caution for a moment. "Worth more than this patch of dirt, that's for sure." "Funny thing about dirt," Daniel replied. "Men like you always figure you can own it. Men like me always end up buried in it if we're not careful." The yard was very quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. Behind the riders, on the ridgeline where the storm-scoured pines clung to the slope, movement flickered in the trees. At first Daniel thought it was his vision swimming again. Then he saw the glint of sun on metal, the shape of a hat brim. Another. He wasn't the only one who had heard horses last night when the storm had been at its loudest. He wasn't the only one who had decided today was long enough. The first rider started to say something, an order, a threat. He never got it out. A voice rang from the tree lean, clear and hard as a church bell. "Guns down," it called. "Now!" A dozen men stepped out from among the thin pines, rifles in their hands. They wore no badges, but they carried something heavier. The set of people who had reached the end of old fear. Daniel recognized some of them, even from a distance. The big man who ran the feed store in town. A farmer whose boy Briggs' men had put in the dust behind the livery 2 summers ago. The preacher from Red Ridge, collar crooked, eyes fierce. Others he didn't know, but he knew their type. Folks with enough taken from them that the math had finally turned. The riders shifted, horses dancing under the sudden pressure. "You sure you boys want to do this?" the lead one asked, trying for swagger and not quite finding it. "Briggs sits in a warm room while you throw your lives away on a drift farmer and an outlaw. He's got friends in places your names won't even reach. We're already past worrying about who's comfortable," the preacher said. "Briggs taught us that when he lit my sister's barn with her in it. Put your weapons down, son. Go home, or you can ride back and tell him the ridge doesn't belong to his kind anymore." The wind tugged at coattails and hat brims. For a moment, the whole world seemed to balance on the barrel of a gun, on the line of a decision. The riders looked at each other, looked at Daniel, at Mara, at the men in the trees. One of them muttered a curse under his breath, then slowly eased his rifle back into its boot. Another followed. The third turned his horse without a word and started back down the track, jaw clenched. The last man, the one who'd spoken for Briggs at the start, stayed where he was a moment longer. "You think you've won something here," he said finally. "All you've done is delay the world. Men like Briggs don't disappear. They just find roads where you're not standing." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but today this is the road, and you're going to be on the far end of it by the time the sun moves." Slowly, grudgingly, the man tipped his hat. "Reckon I'm done freezing on this hill for a day's wage," he said. "You want to throw away your peace, preacher? That's your business. I'll go tell Briggs the ridge has teeth now." He wheeled his horse. Snow kicked up in a spray beneath hooves. One by one, the Ridge Company riders disappeared down the track, their shapes shrinking against the wide, bright land. For a long moment after they were gone, no one moved. Then, slowly, the men in the trees lowered their guns. The preacher let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting on his chest for 3 years. "Didn't think he'd ride out," he admitted. "He didn't expect you to be here," Mara said. The farmer who'd lost his boy stepped closer to the cabin, hat twisting in his big hands. "We came as soon as we heard Keating was sniffing around," he said. "Figured trouble might make its way out here first. You could have sent for us sooner, Mara. You shouldn't have had to stand alone this long." Her mouth trembled just once. Her fingers tightened on the shotgun. "I didn't think anyone would come," she said. "Not after the last sheriff said there wasn't anything to be done." "We believed him then," the preacher said. "We don't anymore." They stayed for a while, long enough to share coffee, to ask about fence lines and seed, to offer spare hands if the barn roof needed mending. Their voices filled the cabin and yard, not loud, but steady, like the sound of a river that had been dammed too long starting to run again. Daniel sat on the porch steps, shoulder throbbing, listening to the low hum of them. He watched Mara answer each offer with a mix of wariness and something that might, with time, become trust. Eventually the men drifted away, back into the trees, back to their farms and small houses. The preacher touched 2 fingers to his hat brim as he passed Daniel, a rough, forgiving salute to a man whose past he might know something about and had decided not to mention. The yard emptied. The world grew quiet again, except for the distant rush of the creek and the occasional groan of the barn as it adjusted to the new weight of the day. Mara closed the door with a soft click. The strength Daniel had been borrowing from somewhere gave out all at once. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the table, breath hissing between his teeth. Mara was there in an instant, anger and worry laid tight over each other. "You're bleeding again," she said. "Sit." He obeyed. The chair complained under his weight, the room swaying in slow circles. She peeled back the bandage with steady fingers. Fresh blood had seeped along the edge where the graze from a stray shot had opened his healing wound anew. "You shouldn't have stepped out there," she muttered, dipping a cloth in water gone cool. "Could barely hold the rifle straight. If I hadn't, they'd have seen it," he said. "Men like that can smell weakness. You know that. They'd have used me like kindling." She pressed the cloth to his shoulder, not gently. He grunted. "Doesn't mean you had to go courting dying," she said. He watched her face as she worked, the scar along her jaw, the set of her mouth. The way her hands were calm, even as her voice shook on the edges of certain words. "You were scared," he said quietly. "Not of them. Not exactly." She hesitated, then nodded. I was scared you'd die on that porch, she said. For land that isn't yours. For a woman you don't know. Daniel caught her wrist, gently. She could have pulled away. She didn't. You told me not to come closer that first night, he said. You were trying to keep me clear of this. Of you. Of everything that lives on this ridge. You think you're cursed, Mara? You're not. You're just the only thing standing between this place and the men who burn it. Her throat worked. Her gaze dropped to where his hand circled her wrist, thumb resting at the beat of her pulse. I think I'm tired, she whispered. He let her go. Then rest, he said. You've earned it 10 times over. She finished binding his shoulder without speaking. When she stepped back, her eyes had gone calm again, like a sky after a storm. Not clear, exactly, but steady. You can stay, she said abruptly, until you heal, until you decide where you're riding next. He looked past her through the small window at the land beyond. A patchwork of snow and earth and brush. The sky beyond it had softened. The harsh, unforgiving glare of morning had given way to a gentler light that touched the drifts and fence posts without making them look smaller. I thought maybe, he said, surprising himself with the shape of the words, this time I'd ride less and stay more. Somewhere. Here, she asked. He met her gaze. Unless you're still telling me to turn around, he said. Mara studied him a long moment, all the weight of her years and losses and the stubborn, quiet thing that kept her here in that one look. Don't come closer, she said softly. He blinked, uncertain. Her mouth curved then, small and crooked and real. Not unless you mean to stay, she added. Something that had been knotted in his chest for a very long time loosened, thread by thread. I've been running from who I was for so long my horse is about worn through, he said. Seems as good a place as any to stop and build something instead of burning it. She turned away toward the stove, but he saw the way her shoulders eased, just a little. Then we'll see if you can swing a hammer one-handed, she said. Barn roof leaks. Fence is half-rot. Chickens I don't own, yet need a coop. I can manage that, he said. Never worked for chickens before. Might be a decent change. Most things are, she replied. Spring came late to Chalk Ridge that year. It crept in wary, like something that had been driven off enough times it no longer trusted its welcome. Snow lingered in the shadows of the pines long after the valley turned to mud. The creek ran full and fast with melt, its voice louder, more insistent. Daniel healed in stages. The wound in his shoulder shrank from an angry red bite to a patch of puckered skin that itched when he worked too hard. He learned the language of Mara's cabin, the way the door needed a firm hand on damp mornings, the little sideways pull on the stove handle that coaxed smoke up the chimney instead of into the room. Days found him mending fence posts with the careful, methodical patience of a man paying off an old debt one nail at a time. Mara worked alongside him more often than not, sleeves rolled, hands as sure with a hammer as they were with a needle. Together they straightened the barn, walked its sagging roof with salvaged planks, and hammered the weak spots into something like strength. They coaxed a reluctant garden out of soil that had seen more neglect than care for too many seasons. Mara showed him where the land dipped just enough to hold water, where the wind came hardest, and what to plant along that line to break it. He dug rows and turned earth, and tried not to think about how far this all was from the life he'd spent avoiding. Some nights they sat on the porch steps and watched the sky spin itself in color over the dark line of the hills, gold to rose to a bruised purple that finally surrendered to the first sharp stars. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a road they walked side by side. Little by little, pieces of themselves came out into the open between tasks and in those quiet evenings. Daniel told her about the men he'd once ridden with. Not all of it. Enough. About the time Briggs had offered him steady pay to light a fire under a foreman's house and make it look like accident. About how the smell of burning cotton and hair had lodged in his lungs for weeks after he'd refused and walked away. About Marshall Keating's flat eyes when they'd met on opposite sides of jail cell, once in a different state, and the way those eyes had changed when his name came up again under someone else's crime. Mara told him, in fewer words, about the months after Ellison fell in their yard, about the way the town had stopped saying her name out loud, as if grief were catching, about the night she'd almost packed what she could carry and left the ridge behind. "What stopped you?" he asked. She thought about it for a while, head tipped back against the cabin wall, eyes on the strip of sky between the roofline and the trees. "I woke one morning before the sun," she said. "Frost everywhere. On the fence rails, on the old plow, on the cracked bucket by the well. Turned everything into glass. Things I've been looking at for years and not seen, not really. It was beautiful, in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Maybe ever." She shrugged, but her voice had gone somewhere softer. "I couldn't leave that," she said. "Couldn't let men like Briggs be the last ones who touched this land. So I stayed." He didn't say it, but he knew something of that kind of choosing, of seeing how ugly a thing could get and deciding to plant something living in the middle of it anyway, just to prove the ground would still take a seed. Some days he caught Mara watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Not with suspicion, as before. With a kind of puzzled consideration, like someone testing the ice on a river that had been frozen too long and was just starting to run. One afternoon, with the fence mended and the worst of the mud dried into hard, cracked patterns, Daniel leaned against the post he'd just set and listened to the aching quiet that comes when land starts trusting spring again. His shoulder was little more than a faint aware spot under his shirt now. Hoofbeats drifted up the track. His hand went to his hip before he remembered the gun hanging on a peg just inside the door. It had been there more days than it hadn't lately. He let it fall back to his side. A single rider appeared over the rise. Young, thin in the way of someone who hadn't yet had enough years to fill out, with a star catching the light at his chest. He rode a bay horse with more enthusiasm than sense. He dismounted near the fence, dust puffing around his boots. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat to Mara, who'd come up beside Daniel, wiping earth from her hands. "Sir, name's Eli Turner. Out of Spirit Hollow. Sheriff's man now." "You're late," Mara said, but there was no heat in it. Eli ducked his head, embarrassed. "Couldn't get clear sooner," he said. "Word's been going around about what happened up here. About folks standing up. People wanted to talk, to ask if it was real." He looked from Daniel to Mara, eyes bright with something like hope and fear tangled together. "Briggs is gone," he said. "Or gone from here, anyway." Some of his men drifted through town, looking smaller without him behind them. Others went east. Sheriff Keating took notes. Wrote letters. "There's warrants going out. Won't be quick, but..." He lifted one shoulder. "Briggs won't be riding up this ridge again. Not with half the valley watching." Something in Daniel's chest loosened. He hadn't known it was knotted until it started to unkink. "And the law?" Mara asked. "That same law that walked past my husband's grave and said there wasn't anything to be done?" Eli swallowed. "No, ma'am," he said. "We're writing it down. All of it. Names. Dates. What he took. People deserve to know it wasn't the wind that did it to them." He hesitated, then reached into his coat. "Got this for you," he said, holding out a folded, creased paper toward Mara. Judge and Redcliffe signed off. Title: Proper. Says this land's yours. Not rented from Briggs Company. Not held in trust for men who never touched a shovel. Yours. She took it slowly like it might bite. Smoothing it open with careful fingers, she stared at the ink as if it were written in a language she half remembered. "And if someone else comes along?" she asked, "with a different company name. Smoother words. More money than Briggs ever saw." Eli's mouth pulled into something that might, with practice, become a wry smile. "Then we'll remember this time," he said. "And we won't let you stand on your porch alone while we pretend we don't see." He stayed long enough to share a cup of coffee and pet the dun mare's nose, laughing when she snapped at his sleeve. Then he swung back into the saddle and rode down the track, the sinking sun turning the dust his horse kicked up into little clouds of gold. Mara stood by the fence, paper in hand, watching until he disappeared. "You all right?" Daniel asked. She nodded slowly. "It's a strange thing," she said. "Having a piece of paper say what I already knew in my bones." "That this land is yours?" he said. She glanced up at him, some new softness at the edges of her eyes. "That this land is ours," she corrected quietly. The words settled between them with surprising ease. That night the sky scrubbed itself clear, as if the storms of the last months had finally wrung themselves empty. The stars came out in their thousands, sharp and white, and close enough it felt like a man could stand on the ridge and touch one if he stretched. The air held a different kind of chill now. Not the killing cold of deep winter, but the lingering coolness that follows warm days and precedes warmer ones. Daniel sat on the porch steps with a small chunk of pine in his hands and a knife he'd modestly claimed was dull. Shavings curled at his boots like pale ribbons as he coaxed the shape of a horse out of the wood. It wasn't much to look at yet, too thick at the neck, one leg shorter than the others, but the outline was there, waiting for refinements. Inside the cabin, he could hear Mara moving about, dishes knocking softly together, the low hum of a tune under her breath, tuneless but steady. The sound of someone who had stopped listening for other footsteps at the door and accepted the ones that were already there. He turned the carving in his hand, thumb rubbing at a rough spot along the flank. It felt like an honest thing, making something with his hands that had no use beyond being what it was. He wondered briefly if this was how mending fence and patching roofs would feel when he wasn't counting each nail against some old wrong. The door creaked open. Mara stepped out onto the porch, arms wrapped loosely around herself against the breeze. "You're going to whittle that thing down to a matchstick if you keep worrying at it," she said. "Just trying to get it right," he replied. "Feels like if I can make one good thing, maybe it'll start evening the ledger." She came to sit beside him on the top step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The lamplight from inside spilled across the boards in a warm pool, fading into the sharper silver of starlight beyond. "Maybe it's not about ledgers," she said. "Maybe it's about direction. Which way you're walking now, not where your boots have already been." He watched her profile, the line of her jaw, the curve of her scar, silver in the mixed light. The way the tension that had lived between her shoulders since the night he'd ridden up was finally starting to let go. "And which way am I walking now?" he asked. She looked at him then, really looked, and whatever answer she'd been swallowing slipped free in her eyes before she found the words. "Towards something," she said, instead of away. They sat in that simple truth for a while, listening to the creak in the distance and the occasional soft rustle of some small creature moving through the grass. After a time, she reached out and took the half-carved horse from his hand. Turning it over, she traced the rough shape of its neck with her thumb. "You'll have time to finish it," she said. "Tomorrow. Next week. Next year." He huffed out a breath that might almost have been a laugh. "You sound awfully sure of that," he said. She tipped her head, considering the little block of pine, the yard, the sky, him. "I told you not to come closer," she said. "You did anyway. Seems only fair I give you something worth the trouble." He watched her, lamplight catching on the curve of her cheek, the scar, the hint of a smile more certain than any he'd seen on her yet. "Reckon you already have," he said. She didn't answer with words, but she smiled, and this time there was nothing careful about it. Somewhere out on the hills, a coyote called, its voice rising and falling in long, lonely notes that didn't sound quite so lonely tonight. The night air moved around them, smelling faintly of damp earth and thawing pine, the scent of things that had survived the worst of the cold and were still, stubbornly, here. Daniel leaned back on his hands, feeling the worn grain of the porch boards under his palms, the solid, steady warmth of the cabin at his back, the quieter, deeper steadiness of the land beneath it all. The ridge was still here. Mara was still here. He was still here. For a man who'd spent most of his life riding away from things, that felt like no small miracle. "Please don't leave me in this storm," she had whispered once. Not with her mouth, but with the way she'd stood in the doorway between him and the dark, shotgun in hand, fear and courage braided tight in her shoulders. His answer had broken her heart in that moment. "I have to," he'd said then, meaning he had to step out beside her instead of keeping to the safe shadows inside. Had to take his place where bullets might find him, had to prove to her and to himself that the man who walked back through the door afterward would be someone different than the one who had walked through so many others alone. He hadn't left her in the storm, and somewhere along the way, without him quite noticing, he'd stopped leaving himself there too. The night turned slowly overhead. The fire behind them burned low but steady, a small, stubborn circle of light holding back the dark. For the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Daniel Price let himself believe that when morning came, he would still be sitting on this porch, in this place, with this woman beside him, exactly where he was supposed to be.